The fact that I was a lesbian, a feminist, and also pro-choice, I never knew which one of those was it that kept me very marginalised.
Today, as part of the Shout Out interview series, we're speaking to Ailbhe Smith, who's been an activist, feminist, and radical in every sense of the word since the late 80s. Thank you so much, Ailbhe, for joining us today. So, Ailbhe, how were you involved in the early gay rights movement?
Well, I was involved in the women's movement in Ireland from kind of the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And I was therefore really very aware of how the Irish gay rights movement was developing, not least because there were a number of lesbians involved in the feminist movement. And I think it's really important to sort of say that the women's movement was there in the 70s, and then the gay rights movement started around about the end of the 70s. So that there was a lot of dovetailing going on, of sort of fitting in one with the other. And a lot of us crossed between the two movements. And I've always done that in my own life. I actually really became involved more at the very end of the 1980s, beginning of the 90s. But having said that, I remember very well back in 1983, when the young chap called Declan Flynn, who was out in Fairview Park, was attacked by several young men, 5 young men. He was very brutally attacked, and he later died of the injuries they had inflicted. And those young chaps got a suspended sentence in the courts. And people were outraged, not only people who were lesbian or gay, but, you know, everybody was outraged. And I remember reading about the big march from Fairview Park to mark people's anger at the leniency of the sentence, but also what had actually happened to this young man, and to highlight the profound homophobia that there was in Ireland back then. We still have homophobia, but this was another planet. We were completely invisible. So over the years, of course, I had a lot of contact with lesbians and gays, and particularly with lesbians. I suppose there was a bit more of a separation between lesbians on the one hand and gay men on the other in those days, which I think we began to heal that separation in the 1990s. And I should say, for, you know, anybody who, well, everybody's younger than me, but for everybody young, everybody young who's listening, we didn't think about trans people. I mean, it just wasn't on the agenda, never mind non-binary or intersex. So when I say lesbian and gay, that's what the movement was at that time and throughout the 90s, and indeed well into the early 2000s. So it's really quite interesting to think. When I think back, we were and we felt very radical, but actually our view was really quite limited. And I think that happens to every generation. You think you're out there in the vanguard, and you are, and you're opening up the pathways, but there's more and there's more and there's more to come. And that's for the next generation. I mean, I really became involved, I think, I suppose really I was in UCD as a lecturer, where I actually spent 40 years of my life, and I felt this is ridiculous. We don't talk about lesbian and gay issues here at all. And I decided to set up a conference for lesbians called Lesbian Lives, which deeply shocked the establishment in UCD, but which was a roaring success with lesbians in Ireland, not just in Dublin. And I'm delighted to say that Lesbian Lives is still going strong.
So you speak there about the shock of the establishment when you created this. So what happened, and what challenges did you face from the university, from society as a whole? What was it like to be, you were the vanguard then yourself?
Well, I suppose we really were, actually. And I do recall nobody in UCD attacked me explicitly or formally, and I wasn't sanctioned in any very formal way. But it was very clear that I was marginalised. And later on in the 1990s, around I can't remember, 95 or 96, I didn't get promoted when I should have been promoted. And I took an equality case against the university. And I didn't actually win that case, although UCD did have to change its procedures. But there was no doubt in my mind that the fact that I was a lesbian, a feminist, and also pro-choice, I never knew which one of those was it that kept me very marginalised in UCD. I just never made any headway with the promotions. However, I set up women's studies, and I was head of women's studies all during that time. And my job was permanent. So I felt that I had quite a lot of safety and security in my job, and that I couldn't be got rid of. I wasn't going to maybe advance very far, but I also had, a fair amount of power. And I thought, as, a good card-carrying feminist and LGBT activist, that I needed to use that power to expand our thinking about these issues to do with gender and sexuality. And I really did. I think I was very lucky that I was in a permanent job. You just couldn't have done that just in any old place. And the discrimination against lesbians and gays in employment was very considerable. I also was able to do it because at that stage, my daughter wasn't living with me anymore. She had gone to live with her father, and I don't talk about that very much. It was very difficult for me. And you could say that in a way, there was nothing worse could happen to me, really, at that stage. So I was perfectly happy to go ahead and try and open up what little bit of space I could where I was working, and also to participate then in sort of the broader movement for change I was always very associated with the National Lesbian and Gay Federation, which had GCN in trust for the community. I was very involved with that always, and very involved with going on all of the marches. We also had Lesbian Pride a few times, which was great fun. And I was involved with the Gays Film Festival for several years. Whatever was going on, I mean, I didn't say to myself, okay, I've got to get out there and do this one thing. What was sort of possible for me was to be really involved in a number of different things, because I didn't have a reputation to lose or to be afraid of. I was known as a feminist, lesbian, radical. That was not a good thing to be known as in polite society. I'm laughing now. But sometimes I'm kind of really astonished at, if I say it myself, I'm astonished at how brave we were, Donal. We did have to be very brave because we were a very silenced community. And we were also even then, very diverse and very kind of fractured, because there was definitely that gap between gay men and lesbians. And that was inevitable in the early years, but I was very, very, very pleased when that really healed. And it kind of healed actually in the 1990s. And I was very much part of that cohort of women and men who were working hard to overcome that. And we certainly did that through in GCN, and also to look at trans issues. In fact, the first time I really came across trans difficulties, if you like, in the public arena was back in about 93 or 4, when one of the sessions of Lesbian Lives at UCD, that conference that I set up, workshop day really, a group decided that a trans woman should not be in that group in one of the breakout sessions. And they asked her or told her to leave. And I was very upset by that and very angry. Yeah. At the end of the day, in my wrap-up speech, I said, we don't do that to anybody. We are not separatist in that regard, number one. So nobody gets thrown out of things. And number two, we have to bear in mind that we as lesbians, and I was obviously talking to a bunch of lesbians, we as lesbians have a huge and acute understanding of what it is to be discriminated against and to be excluded and marginalized and made invisible. And why are we not extending that to trans people who are even more marginalized and discriminated against and invisibilized?
So we were also involved in the same-sex marriage referendum. What was your role during the referendum, and what was it like to be involved then?
Well, people sort of think, oh, that was 2015. No, it wasn't. It goes way back to the early 2000s and actually 2007 when Marriage Equality, the organisation Marriage Equality, formed, and I became involved in that. And that was after Catherine Zappone and her partner, wife, the late Anne Louise Gilligan, had actually taken a case to court. So it actually went back a long way. You don't win referendums in 9 months. You're out there lugging around and doing all of the groundwork for years and years and years. So I became involved in 2007 in the organisation Marriage Equality, and I was I was chair of the National Lesbian and Gay Federation. At that time, I was chair of that for something like 10 or 12 or 14 years or something. And it was very important for us to be involved because the National Lesbian and Gay Federation and GCN really worked very hard to make the public, make people in the community in the first place aware of why marriage equality really mattered. In fact, we ran a couple of conferences on that theme of marriage matters. So I became involved at that stage and just really carried on right up to the time of the referendum. So, I mean, that involved obviously being present at all of the developing the different kinds of research, the strategic thinking, the meetings, the awareness raising, all of that work that we were doing throughout the 2000s. And at that time, Gráinne Healy and Denise Charlton were really the chairs, I think, they were the chairs of Marriage Equality. And when it came nearer the referendum time, I was part of, I just carried on and was part of the strategic group of people that came together from Marriage Equality and from Glen, which at that time was a really very important gay and lesbian equality network organisation. And they had been promoting civil partnership, which caused some disagreement between Marriage Equality and Glen. But nonetheless, we came together in the most positive and constructive way that you could imagine to fight the referendum for marriage equality. And we did that about 2012 probably to do that. And I was part of that strategic group and continued on as part of the central kind of strategy group of 5 or 6 people throughout the referendum. I wasn't a spokesperson, and I think that's kind of interesting. I wouldn't have been a good spokesperson. I was, I have whatever reputation as being a radical. And also, as a feminist, I had, for a long time, a very stringent critique of marriage. And, had to work my way through that when I began to understand, well, it's okay for me to have, a critique of marriage, and I think it's a valid critique. At the same time, I have to recognize the everyday reality of people's lives doesn't necessarily fit the theory. And people do want to get married. My own daughter, I remember when she was getting married, she lived in the States at the time. She rang me and she said, Mum, I have something to tell you, and I don't know what you're going to think of it, but I'm getting married. I said, oh, I'm thrilled, I'm delighted. And she said, I thought you were against marriage. I said, yeah, but not for people. If that's something that people, and I can understand it. So much of our society is based on marriage. I wish it wasn't, but it is actually, and that's a reality. And in order to protect your rights, and particularly those of your family, and why shouldn't lesbians and gays and everybody be able to have children? And why don't we all have the same rights anyway? I do not approve of rights for some people and not for others. Even if I have a problem with the particular right, If it is for some people, it needs to be open to absolutely everybody. And then we can fight it if we want and critique it as to whether we want it at all. But so that was, I wasn't a spokesperson, quite rightly, I think, at that stage, because the opposition were very good at putting out videos that you'd made in the 1980s, you know, where you'd said this thing or that thing or the other. But it was, of course, an absolutely extraordinary campaign, and it was a huge privilege to be involved with it. It was led by Gráinne Healy and Brian Sheehan he was from Glen. And really, they were absolutely fantastic. And it was a brilliant team. It was just a very, very, very real privilege. I have to say, at the same time, I was developing the campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment. So it was very, very, very busy. And I knew if we won marriage equality, that we could win repeal. You know, you sort of got to break people down gradually. And we did both.
Thank you so much for letting us interview today, and we really appreciate it. And thank you for all the work you've done and all the work you continue to do.
Oh, thanks, John. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you.